You are with Cape Talk.
Views and news with Clarence Ford.
It is time, that big appointment that we have every Friday after 9:30. We have the pleasure of hosting the Naked Scientist. Dr. Chris Smith joins us once again, lecturer at Cambridge University in the UK. And he's going to answer all your questions. So keep them coming through via WhatsApp on 072 567 1567. You can call. We'll prioritize that call. 021 446 0567. Welcome, Chris. Great to have you back.
Morning, Clarence. I like your Cape Talk top. Can I have one?
Oh, you can see me.
I can see you. Yeah, you see, you can't see me. I don't
forget
have a
some
camera in this studio. It's kind of, and I've got a perfect face for radio anyway, so that's fine for me. But no, I do like your top. That's very nice. Where can I get one?
Yeah, well, I think it's like special issue. We had a collaborative effort with 702 out in a really far-flung space in South Africa, and that's where this one comes from. So it's collectors. It's a collector's item. But I'll see if I can do something for you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. It's been a big week this week for science in Africa in the respect that we saw, I don't know if you saw this, the headlines that Egypt has now joined the ranks. I think they're the 44th country to officially eliminate malaria from the whole of Egypt, which they've been trying to do for thousands of years in some respects, but certainly with a concerted effort since the 1920s. And for the last 3 consecutive years, they've now been confirmed malaria transmission free, which ticks a big box for the World Health Organization. They can now say they have eliminated malaria. Many other countries, obviously, I think there's 85 countries aspire to do likewise. It's one of the biggest disease scourges around the world, and it's one of many, of course, but it's still a big step in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think it remains the biggest killer on the African continent. And great to hear that. That's absolutely good news. Jimmy's got a question in. Jimmy wants to know if all the colors of the rainbow are visible to animals and insects, or do they see less or more than we do?
Well, the reason we can see colours at all is because we have receptors in our eyes that are sensitive to different colours or wavelengths of light. And when you look at white light, we see white, but white is a mixture of different colours. And the perception of white light, when it activates our eyes, is a white colour. But that's because we have a certain spectrum of receptors that detect those different wavelengths. Different animals are sensitive to different wavelengths. We can see colours using 3 different colour detecting cones in our eyes, red ones, green ones, blue ones, to put it simply. But other animals like dogs and deer and cats have 2 colour receptors, so they see a slightly different spectrum of colours. So effectively they're a bit like a colourblind human. Some animals have got about 5 different ways of detecting violet colours, and I think mantis shrimps can see colours of violet and even ultraviolet that we can't. Bees, bumblebees, they can see into the ultraviolet. We can't see that. So it all comes down to how sensitive your visual apparatus is to different colours that make up the light spectrum, some of which we can see, some of which we can't, some of which they can see, some of which we can't. So it really comes down to what an organism has evolved to do, and it uses or makes best use of the light. Why would bees need to see UV? Because they navigate by the sun. And if the sun is concealed behind clouds, you wouldn't be able to see it with your visual light, with visible light, but UV comes through, so they can see this sort of searchlight of UV coming through clouds wherever the cloud cover is, so they can always navigate.
There's a voice note in, Joe. Let's go to that voice note.
Clarence, môre man vir jou en vir Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, eyesight. Why is it that I can spot you or someone a mile away? But when I use my phone, I cannot even see on the screen without my glasses. Yeah, that starting to happen like 4 years ago. And yeah, I have to wear reading glasses. What is busy happening or what has happened? Thank you. Have a good show. Bye-bye.
As we get older, the lens in the front of the eye stiffens. And the lens is there to add a final bit of tweaking to the focusing. The cornea on the front of the eye does most of the focusing heavy lifting. It does about 85+% of focusing the light that comes in. But behind the cornea is a lens that can change shape. And you have muscles called ciliary muscles that squeeze and stretch the lens to change how thick it is. That changes its refractive index, how strong a magnifier it is, and that in turn affects where the light falls on your retina. And with age, we develop a condition called presbyopia, where stiffening of the lens means it doesn't thicken or doesn't stretch out quite as easily and to quite the extent it used to, so our focusing range is diminished. There's still a sweet spot in the middle of the visual range where you have excellent vision, and that's what's being alluded to here. You can see far without too much difficulty, but when you want to see close to you, you need to make the lens get much thicker and stronger as a refractive lens, and that it struggles to do. So in order to see something close to you, you have to focus the light more powerfully to keep it as a tight spot on your retina, and because the lens is stiffer, you can't do that, and as a result, you can't see things that are much, much closer to you. How do we combat that? Well, you put on a pair of reading glasses. The reading glasses are a magnifying lens, so they take over some of the effect of what the lens would normally do, and then the lens has to bend itself a bit less in order to finish the focusing job, and you can still read. So that's why as we get older, we need reading glasses. And that, unfortunately, is an inevitability. Most people, by the age of 50, are beginning to notice that things that they previously did not struggle to see close to them, they're having to develop arm extensions. And you'll see people developing the long arm syndrome, where they're holding things out initially a bit further away, but eventually between finger and index, thumb and index finger at arm's length, and then they have to usually succumb and go and get some glasses.
Brian writes on WhatsApp, in the light of, I think it's Li-ion batteries, please correct me if I'm wrong, catching fire, are there safer battery types that can be used in confined spaces?
Well, this is a reference to the fact that lithium batteries have taken the world by storm. This is not a brand new technology. It's been an evolving technology over decades, but they've now got extremely good. The reason we have cars on our roads with ranges of hundreds of kilometres, the reason we have mobile phones that are so slim that they can easily slip into your pocket, where previously you had something that was basically a portable battery with a little bit of radio telephony attached to it. That's all down to lithium-ion battery technology. They're really, really good at storing enormous amounts of energy, but the problem is that when you store, dissipate, charge, discharge that amount of charge, you get a lot of heat. And sometimes these batteries can develop faults, which means that you have something very, very flammable, which is the lithium material inside the battery getting very, very hot. And when it gains access to the oxygen in the air, it can catch fire. And the fires can rage at very high temperatures and be very hard to put out, especially in industrial complexes. This does happen, but thankfully very, very rarely. And most of the time, it's happening with poorly designed, poorly crafted or cheap, I don't want to say rip-off, but cheaper alternatives which are mass manufactured in countries with lower standards of engineering. Most of the really high-end manufacturers do not have this problem, and when they do, they're very, very rare, but it can happen. And obviously we know that this is a risk, so what are manufacturers doing about it? Whole raft of things. Various safety measures being built into batteries, thermal detection to prevent over-discharge or overload, and measures to self-extinguish, cool the batteries down if this kind of thing begins to happen. So people do have ways of combating this, but if you invest in cheaper technology or older technology that might not have that, there is a risk.
Another question, Ian, about efficiencies improving around batteries. The question by James, simply, do you think phones in the next couple of years will get bigger or smaller?
It's interesting, this, isn't it? Because that we went through a period where small was the thing and people were trying to shrink things down farther and farther and farther. And then we got to a point where fat thumbs began to become a real problem. You could not type out your messages because the keys you were trying to tap on, you needed the Hubble Space Telescope as well as reading glasses in order to resolve where the button you were trying to push was. This has now sort of reversed, and also the kinds of functions that we're using phones for have expanded. They've gone from just a telephony device and something you occasionally send a text message on to something that basically dominates our life. People's wallets are largely being replaced by their phones. Men don't carry around a wallet so much anymore. They just carry a phone. You don't carry a map anymore. You have a phone. And so all these devices are being shunted onto mobile phones. And so the emphasis now is expanding the repertoire of functions. And that means expanding the size, because the constraints began to kick in of the size again. There will eventually, I think, be a sweet spot, though, because if you make something too small, it becomes impractical. If you make it too big, you can't shove an iPad in your pocket, for example. practical, it becomes impractical. So there will be a point at which I think phones will get to a stage where people say, well, I'm comfortable carrying this, I'm comfortable using this, it comfortably fits in my pocket and I don't break it every time I bend over, which is the other problem. But I can also use it for practical things, and it's not difficult to see, difficult to read, or difficult to use. So I think we will probably get to a point where we get them to a certain size and they don't get any bigger. They will certainly continue to have longer battery life because battery technology continues to improve, and other functions will improve, like the processing, so they can do more and do more quickly. But I think there's a fundamental size limit that is the one that we'll centre on, because that's the one that most people will find the most helpful, the most useful, and the most practical.
Yeah, I see that coming through as well. Let's go to the WhatsApp line. A question in for Dr. Chris Smith, the naked scientist.
Good morning, Clarence, and good morning, Dr. Smith. It's Felicity. I am just interested in trying to find out what the difference is between a brown shell egg and a white shell egg. I personally have never seen a white shell egg, but on TV, it seems to be in Europe, America, Britain, whatever. They have a lot of white shelled eggs. Is there a difference, and what is it? Thank you. Bye.
Hello, Felicity. Do you know, I had never seen a white-shelled chicken's egg until relatively recently, and now I'm buying loads of them from the supermarket. In fact, I had one for breakfast yesterday. And really it comes down to what chicken laid that egg, because the reason the eggs have colour and pigmentation, it's added during the egg shell formation. As the egg comes down the oviduct in the chicken, the egg shell has various pigments and pigment molecules added to it. And if the bird is of a breed that adds certain pigments, you'll get eggs of a certain size and colour. So it really comes down to the breed of the chicken, and white eggs are just egg shell, which is calcium carbonate, chalk, without any of those pigments added to it. And if you have a coloured egg, it's the same stuff, but it's got pigment added. It's rather like hair in some respects, that the natural colour of our hair, keratin, protein, different to an egg in composition, obviously, but the natural colour is white. And when we have different hair colours, it's because the cells that have made the hair have added pigment to the white colour, making it look the particular colour it has. And then as we get older and it stops happening, it goes grey and then white. Eggs, that doesn't happen to, because by then the chicken's usually gone into a coma or something.
It is World Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week, Dr. Chris Smith, and we'll be talking about it a little later on. And some interesting results around a study with, is it echinacea or echinacea? Yeah, that one. Just maybe your tips or your advice, your thoughts on increasing occurrence of drug-resistant kind of diseases.
One of the most, I think, practical and sensible things I ever saw written about this was when I lived in Australia. And as you'd walk down Elizabeth Street towards Central Station in Sydney, there was a sign above the arches, and it said, "Common colds need common sense, not antibiotics." That was 20 years ago. And it's alluding to what has become one of the most serious threats in healthcare delivery around the world. And our own former Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, went on the record to say she regards the threat posed by antimicrobial resistance as worse than the threat posed by terrorism. And she was saying that at a time of inflamed tension around the world, so she really meant it. And I've since met her and chatted to her about that, and she made this one of the flagship policies as Chief Medical Officer in the UK. But it affects every country in the world, and it is a really serious problem. And anyone who has been a doctor for a couple of decades will know that the repertoire of drugs available to them to give their patients on the wards, for example, has changed enormously in the last couple of decades. Things which I would routinely offer to surgical patients when I was first working as a doctor, I cannot use those now, because if you look at what comes up when we look at what's the diagnosis for that patient coming out of our lab, most of those drugs I used to use now have the word resistant written against them. The reason this has happened is because of one simple thing, which is the more you use an antibiotic, the more resistance we are going to see globally. And As soon as Fleming invented penicillin, he was able to demonstrate he got resistance almost immediately to penicillin. It's just taken a very long time for enough of it to be used all over the world for us to get a lot of resistance to drugs like penicillin. And every time we move the goalpost by making a new antibiotic drug, which works in a slightly different way, and the bacteria don't have the biochemical know-how to dismantle it, it takes a while for them to catch up. But they do pretty quickly, because what's happening is that out there in nature, there's a huge diversity of microorganisms, and they have a whole range of different genes which enable them to operate and work and do different things metabolically. So as soon as you start using a certain drug, you will select in nature, because these things all go down the drain and end up in the environment, you will start selecting for microbes that are not killed by that particular drug that you've invented. And they will share with other bacteria the genetic know-how of how to dismantle that antibiotic drug. And this is because bacteria, one of the aspects of their biology, they can share pieces of genetic information very, very rapidly. They just spit little circles of DNA out called plasmids, which go into other bacteria, and they can use them. It's a bit like me finding a USB drive in the street and putting it in my computer, and there's all kinds of useful files and software on there. Other bacteria can do that. So the more of an antibiotic we use, the more we enrich in the environment the repertoire of bacteria that are now resistant to that, just by virtue of the fact they randomly could break down that antibiotic, and they then share the genetic know-how with more and more pools of bacteria, and eventually that makes its way into the kinds of bacteria that affect humans. And this is unfortunately a moving target, and it's a worsening problem. And with a highly mobile world population, we've got people travelling all over the place all the time. Millions of people are airborne around the planet at any one moment in time. People take their antibiotic-resistant bacteria with them. So we're now seeing a big problem with microbes called Acinetobacter baumannii, which are a particular group of microorganisms that we have almost no antibiotics to treat. And if we see these people in hospital, we have to be very, very careful to make sure that we isolate them and don't infect other patients from them, because once you're colonized with that particular microbe, it really spells disaster for being able to treat you with most of the common, safe and well-tolerated antibiotics. And that's just one example. There are many others. So this is a really, really big problem, and one we need to take very seriously. And going back to where I started, the reason that a lot of antibiotics get used is because they're used unnecessarily. When people have coughs and colds, 90+% of the time your sore throat, your runny nose and your headache is caused by a virus, which is a totally different organism that won't be affected by an antibiotic. So the best thing to do is not take antibiotics. It is to use your common sense. Go and get some simple remedies like paracetamol, aspirin if you can take it not on an empty stomach, ibuprofen, that kind of thing, and take it easy for a couple of days while the symptoms resolve. You probably don't need antibiotics, and it will be better for you in the long run anyway, because you won't damage your own good bacteria in the process.
And that, unfortunately, is all that we have time for. However, I have confirmation that we have a T-shirt for you, the one that I'm wearing at this moment in time. You're
going to wash it first, aren't you, Clarence?
site.
You're going to put it through the wash first. I don't want it after you've been just directly off from the studio. I mean, you're working up a sweat
This
there
is official
in the studio.
from Tessa. It's going to be washed and wrapped, and it's going to be sprayed with that new smelling spray. It's going to be delivered to you, and you're going to need to take a photograph that we can show it to thereafter. So sizes are important, and that communication hopefully will happen with you in a short while. But again, a big thank you to the Naked Scientist, Dr. Chris Smith. James says, Clarence, why do you have ads between, during the Naked Scientist? It's like that. It's because of ads that we can have the Naked Scientist. The chicken and the egg. Haven't we been talking about the chicken and egg? Marble says, different breeds of chickens lay different color eggs. I have chickens called Easter eggs. They lay green eggs, and clearly he's got
they lay chocolate
different
eggs.
breeds of chickens. He's shown me his basket of eggs. They're all very different.
You are with Cape Talk.
Views and news with Clarence Ford.